Today we are going to discuss about the analytic philosophy. As I told you right in the beginning, we shall keep it to the minimal information without going into the details of the different nuances given by different philosophers. However, it is important for us to understand what this analytic philosophy is. Analytic philosophy is a prominent school of the 20th century. Basically, this school emerged in the English-speaking countries in Great Britain as well as in the United States of America. So, analytic philosophy existed in the States alongside pragmatic philosophy. So, some of the features may be common, and whenever there is a similarity, I will try to underline that similarity at that point in time. Now, some of the important analytical philosophers, you might have been aware of the names at least, like for example, when you hear about Bertrand Russell, he has got volumes of work called History of Philosophy. So he is well known in the philosophical circles, particularly in the English-speaking countries. I have often been amazed at visiting any bookstore in India where I look for the philosophical section. Most often you find the books of Russell. So that comes from probably the influence of Britain in our own country, that Russell is widely read in India, at least among the philosophical circles. The other philosophers are Ludwig Wittgenstein, Austin, Moore is also a moral philosopher, and Quine. So now if you notice, these philosophers, they are not, all of them are not addressing the same concerns. Some of them do have something in common. I will enumerate what is the commonality in a moment. But they may touch upon any branch of philosophy, but generally their interest lies in the question of knowledge, or what is in philosophy known as epistemology. Based on that, of course, it branches out to other areas in philosophy as well. Now, why do we call it analytical philosophy? Now, among the philosophical circle, this school of philosophy is distinguished from what is known as continental philosophy. Now, when we speak about continental philosophy, we are talking about the mainland European continent, the philosophical schools that exist in the contemporary times there, like existentialism, phenomenology, and so on. That is normally described as continental philosophy. Whereas, basically what is in the Anglo-Saxon countries is known as analytical philosophy. But this is not to be merely understood as a geographical distinction. In fact, some of the important analytical philosophers are not from English-speaking country. For example, philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein himself is from Austria, and this analytical philosophy also has a link with what is known as the Vienna Circle. The Vienna Circle is a group of philosophers in Vienna. We have not only Wittgenstein, but I also have people like Carnap and others, who are even Frege. They are from the Vienna Circle. Frege is one of the leading analytical philosophers, and some people even think he was one of the founding members. I mean, when I speak about founding members, you cannot think that one day suddenly some group of people said, now let us found a philosophical school called analytical philosophy. That is not the case. When you speak the founding member, would mean the philosopher on whom the successive thinkers have taken inspiration and have developed that idea. So it is not merely a geographical distinction, though for the most part it is identified with an Anglo-Saxon school of thought, but it has to be seen more in terms of the other methodological differences. Now, what would be the methodological differences? The first methodological difference is that in the continental philosophy, philosophers try to address the philosophical question, or the larger question in the philosophy, in a more synthetic manner, in a more integrated manner. Whereas the analytical philosophers are more interested in the analysis. So you break down things in order to analyze. You don't look at things in a synthetic view, in a bird's eye view, but rather break them down into smaller units so that you can analyze the building blocks of a particular thinking or a particular way in which your thought pattern works. Now, when we speak about analysis, what does it mean? You are going to be aware of how thinking gets composed. So you are trying to understand the manner of composition. Now, all schools of philosophy in some way apply analysis. However, analytical philosophy stands out uniquely for a specific reason, because it has certain distinguishing features. They are not interested in any kind of analysis. They are interested in specifically what is known as the logical analysis or the linguistic analysis. I am sure all of you have done a course on logic, and if you have, as part of the course on logic, I'm sure you have had something on symbolic logic. Now, symbolic logic, for example, is something that is specifically developed by this particular school of philosophy known as analytical philosophy. So there is a logical way in which they are analyzing the logic that is involved. Of course, they are also analyzing the language. So this is not a very common way in which the continental philosophy works. Now, again, when the analytical philosophers do philosophy, they consider philosophizing as constructing theoretical reason which is logically consistent and rigorously practiced. So they look for the logic in your reasoning. This doesn't mean the continental philosophers are not looking for logic in your reasoning, but the emphasis as a method is much stronger in the analytical philosophy. Philosophy as a way in which it is logically construed. So if you read Russell's work alongside any of the continental philosophers' work like that of Derrida, you will find the style is drastically different. It's not the same. So analytical philosophy looks at philosophy as a method of problem solving activity. I mean, that is not the same with regard to the continental philosophy as regards the method is concerned. Of course, they are trying to understand the reality, interpret reality, but not so much as problem solving method. Now, another distinguishing feature of analytic philosophy from continental philosophy is the way they look at the history of philosophy. Now, the continental philosophers, as well as the analytical philosophers, they take inspiration from the ancient and the modern philosophers of all the branches of philosophy. Like, for example, both of them would take Plato seriously, or they would take Aristotle seriously, or they would take Descartes, Locke, Hume, Kant, and so on seriously in their history of philosophy. So when they want to refer back to some of the ideas, they may go back to these thinkers. They have no difficulty. However, the continental philosophers also take seriously Hegel, Nietzsche, and those people of the post-Kantian thinkers, as it is known as the 19th century philosophers, or the school of phenomenology like that of Husserl. The continental philosophy takes very seriously, or the subsequent continental philosophers take them seriously, whereas the analytical philosophers just dismiss them. They think they are completely irrelevant because they are not important for philosophical knowledge, according to the analytical philosophers. Now, when did exactly the analytical philosophy began is a matter of debate. Different people, associate its precise, year of origin. Now, for some people, it began with Frege. Frege was someone who is chronologically anterior. He is soon after Kant. He came on the scene. So probably some people call him as the grandfather of the analytical philosophy. He was basically a logician, and he is a philosopher of mathematician. Now, obviously, he is very important, and his thought is very important for philosophical investigation, the analytical philosophy. So one can associate with Hegel, whereas some others would associate more with the later philosopher like Russell. Now, be that as it may, whether it is beginning with Frege as early as the end of 19th century, or as late as the beginning of 20th century. I mean, the time lapse is very, very minimal, so it is not very important in that sense. Now, when we speak about analytical philosophy, as I told you in the beginning, it is not just, though it is one school, it has got different aspects or different dimensions. There are different sub-schools within this analytical philosophy, which is a larger overarching school. The subsections can be considered as the logical atomism. Now, if you have done philosophy of science, probably have not done, but this is a school that is often discussed. And logical positivism, this again is discussed in the philosophy of science or philosophy of mathematics. Then you also have the linguistic philosophy. So these three are the major sub-schools in the analytical philosophy. People also make a distinction between the early analytical philosophy and the late analytical philosophy. So it has got some different nuances and different phases. So if you want to put it as different phases of analytical philosophy, I mean, it has moved from one to another. It did not exist all of them at the same time. It began with the early analytical philosophy, moved on to what is known as a logical atomism, then logical positivism, then you have got linguistic philosophy, and the modern or the late analytical philosophy. We'll just briefly look at each of these things without going into the detail of the different thinkers here involved. Some major ideas I will simply spell it out. In the next lecture, in the asynchronous lecture that we will have on Friday, I will be discussing a couple of philosophers in detail. I think that should be enough for our purpose, because we are not doing a course on analytical philosophy, and we don't want to exhaust all the ideas. Now, the early analytical philosophy began as a protest against the German idealism. Now, if you are not aware of what the German idealism is, the German idealism traces back to Fichte, followed by Schelling, and culminated in Hegel. Now, I'm sure you are mostly aware of Hegel, and we ourselves have referred to him more than once. Particularly when we discussed Karl Marx, I did mention he is a young Hegelian. Now, Hegel thought history develops in terms of the progression of ideas by series of contradictions in terms of thesis and antithesis, and then it reaches a synthesis. Now, the whole thing is all about idea. Now, therefore, this is known as idealism. So, very little it has to do anything with action, or anything to do with the material reality. It is, in that sense, very metaphysical. It's not a physical reality. Idea is not something physical as you would have a material reality, and therefore it is metaphysical. Now, this was the dominant school of the 19th century. Now, the analytical philosophy said, now this is there is no rigor in this whole of idealism. There is no logical accuracies in this idealistic thinking, for example. So now we have, for example, the Wittgenstein, the Russell conversation, and the way in which they have tried to work out this analytical philosophy as an intellectual protest is very clear. For example, Russell, in his autobiographical work titled My Philosophical Development, he wrote it at the end of 19th century, in fact, that he rebelled against the theories of Hegel and Bradley. Bradley is a Hegelian, of course, from the British side. It's a neo-Hegelian, as is often known as. So they are trying to say that these idealistic thinkers do not elaborate the true philosophical knowledge. So therefore their aim is to reform the dominant philosophy of that time. So therefore it is a very strong intellectual protest. So in the early phase of analytical philosophy, one can see as a reaction. It's a reaction to a certain ideal or idealistic tendency in philosophy. Now, this is also the criticism made by G. Moore. Moore, for example, is very, very strongly critical of idealism. The problem for him with idealism is the use of metaphysical language. Now, the use of metaphysical language somehow distances you from the common sense and the ordinary meaning of words. So, metaphysicians tend to ignore the importance of the ordinary use of language, especially the literal meanings of the words, because they would be using word in a very highly sophisticated metaphysical term. So, completely you are alienating yourself from the ordinary language or the common sense language. So therefore, the philosophical sentences for him, from the idealistic point of view, the sentences that are used in philosophy are nothing other than mistakes. They are maybe they are of a different kind, but they are necessarily mistakes. So everyday use of language for Moore is the most apt language for the correct thinking than the sophisticated language of metaphysicians. So in other words, Moore, while criticizing or reacting against the idealism, is also very apologetic about the common sense and the ordinary language. Now, another important component in the first phase of the development of analytical philosophy is also Russell's criticism of monism. Now, monism basically, particularly when you are speaking about monism in the terms of existing reality, would mean, there is the idea holds that one concrete object exists. So the reality is basically one. So the existence of reality is just one. So that is basically, now for Moore, this is somehow dispensing of all the diversity that exists, all the differences that exist. So monism therefore is logically untenable, because in logic you don't seem to have just one thing that exists, because this would be a logical error. So this is false, and it has serious consequences for logic and mathematics, because logic and mathematics also proceeds by the concept of the difference, the differentiation. Whereas here, when you speak about everything is finally one, the way it exists, it does have problem from the logical point of view or from the mathematical point of view. So Russell obviously studies the problem of logic and the foundations of mathematics. So his contribution therefore is very directly related to what is known as logicism. For Russell, obviously, this is mathematical truths can be translated into truths of pure logic. Now, Russell and Frege, they are very similar in their idea here. So if you notice, logic is something that the analytical philosophers harp on very strongly. Of course, logic does have a certain similarity with mathematics. The only difference is in mathematics you use numbers, whereas in logic you may use words, but it should have the same rigor. But obviously later we know that symbolic logic has began using symbols to replace words. So Russell uses his own research and then the results of the research, particularly in the area of logic, to address the different kind of philosophical problems. So if you had to sum up, for Russell's approach, it's not merely a reaction to the ideal philosophy. It's not only an appeal for common sense and ordinary use of language, but it also equally has an emphasis for logic and a very sound critique of what the previous philosophy highly held in esteem, monism. So now that we have the early phase of analytical philosophy and analytical historical development and what is the chief focus, we shall move on to the school called logical atomism. Now, what is this logical atomism? As I told you in the beginning, it has to do with something to do with philosophy of science. Now, I'm sure you're not done any course on philosophy or science, but that's not very important here. Now, logical atomism itself is something that is coined by Bertrand Russell himself. Now, he gave a series of lectures titled The Philosophy of Logical Atomism. Now then he says the purpose of these lectures are basically to explain ideas which he learned from one of his former students. So the name of his former student from whom he learned certain ideas is Ludwig Wittgenstein. He is one of the most influential thinkers in the analytical philosophy. So I will be giving some general ideas about Ludwig Wittgenstein in the next lecture, because we cannot do analytical philosophy without studying Ludwig Wittgenstein, particularly his understanding of language games in some depth, if not exhaustively. Now, what does that mean? Russell and Wittgenstein discussed some of the important philosophical ideas, and each of them came up with different publications as part of the contributions they learned from each other. Now, Russell published the well-known book called Our Knowledge of the External World. Our Knowledge of the External World. He published this in 1914, and then again another book which he published titled The Philosophy of Logical Atomism, that appeared in 1918. Wittgenstein, on his part, published a very mind-blowing work, which I think is one of the most read books, among some scholars, particularly scholars who are interested in the logical aspect of philosophy, which is titled Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. Obviously, it is given in Latin. Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. The title is in Latin, but the work itself is published in German. Remember, Wittgenstein is an Austrian, German-speaking, obviously. This was published in 1921. Of course, got translated in 1922. Obviously, now this is again the result of the discussion that both of them had, Russell and Wittgenstein, and as a result of this work emerged. But of course, Wittgenstein also makes use of not only Russell's ideas but also of Frege, the ideas of Frege, one of the earlier members of the analytical philosophy. Chronologically, he is anterior to Russell. Now, both Russell and Wittgenstein believe. Now, when you analyze the nature of representation and the logical relations, you realize you can understand major philosophical problems in epistemology and metaphysics. The nature of representation. So you know what representation is. So now, for example, ideas are representation of reality. Some people would say that. Or art is a representation of culture, for example. Is something of representation. Now, what is this nature of, analyze this nature of representation and the logical relations that exist between what is represented and what represents, then you do realize that there are serious problems for epistemology and metaphysics. Now, in order to address these serious problems, Russell introduces what is known as the logical atomism. Now, what is logical atomism? In his own words, I quote Russell, "The reason why I call my doctrine logical atomism is because the atoms that I wish to arrive at as the sort of last residue in analysis are logical atoms and not physical atoms. Some of them will be what I call particulars, such thing as patches of color or sounds, momentary things, and some of them will be predicates or relations and so on. Now, logical atoms are basically the smallest particular that exists in your logical thinking. Just like the physical reality is made up of many atoms, if you want to understand the physical universe, you need to look at these atoms that make up the physical universe. So atomism again is one of the things in which scientists, at least philosophers of science, would say the universe is made of. Now, therefore, the ideas or our knowledge is made of such atoms. They are called logical atoms. They are not physical, they are logical atoms. Now, this could every atom would have a certain particularity about it. It could be sometimes just mere relation between things. It could be the predicates. It could be just a momentary thing. It could be color and so on and so forth. So this is what is known as the. Now you realize immediately there is a way in which there is an analysis that is done here. The analysis of the idea is done by way of breaking up the thinking into components, and therefore you look at the different atoms that structure the thinking, that the different components, the different smallest units possible, the particularities. Now this is obviously very important because in metaphysics you always speak about universal, general. Now here for the first time, well, others have also spoken about this earlier, but then in a very, very sophisticated way, Russell brings our attention to this particular thing called logical atomism. So logical atomism basically involves the breaking up of thinking into different smaller, or the smallest possible units in order to analyze it. Now, analyze it logically in terms of the relation it has to other atoms, but also analyze because it is about our thinking. Therefore, the language becomes important part of. I mean, language is very importantly involved in the thinking. You don't think without language, and therefore the analysis of language and the meaning of the terms, etc., and so forth. Now, I told you in some way it has some resemblance to pragmatism. So you remember one of the things that Peirce insisted upon is the clarification of the terms involved. So you can realize when it comes to the a certain convergence exists here from that point of view. Now, Ludwig Wittgenstein, famous Tractatus Logica Philosophicus, apparently was written by him in a very short span of time, and he did that during the First World War time. And in the midst of the war, and probably was also serving the army in Austria at that time, and it was at that time that he apparently wrote the manuscript of this, of course published a little later, obviously. In the Wittgenstein treatise, he argues that the world, the fact of existence of atomic facts would imply that there is a logical picture of facts, that a thought is a significant proposition. In other words, propositions are truth functions of other elementary propositions. So you see the way in which these atoms are one connected to another. So they don't stand apart. There is always a way in which they are dependent on other. So that when you put them together, you get a logical picture of facts. In fact, this came to be known as the picture theory of language. This was the early Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein had two phases. The early Wittgenstein thought we can capture reality in language. The only thing is you should have the right language to capture it. Just like you have the picture of. If you have the good camera, you exactly capture the reality, the physical reality. So also thinking can be captured in language. So so much so, the mind-blowing conclusion of that is, he said, if you cannot speak clearly, you must keep quiet. Whereof you cannot speak clearly, thereof you must pass on to silence. Thereof you must remain silent. Now, philosophy, therefore, for Wittgenstein is dead. Philosophy in the traditional sense of the term, the metaphysical philosophy, because metaphysical philosophy doesn't offer you anything clear. No, there is no clear picture of the reality. It's all about some speculation. It's all about erroneous way of thinking. It's all about some kind of ideas. Fanciful it may be, but it has nothing to do with the reality. So you see how he concluded. That is why it became very, very powerful, this particular book, because of this famous statement of Ludwig Wittgenstein, whereof you cannot whereof you cannot speak, thereof you must pass on to silence, but also his claim that the philosophy is dead. Now, there are some nice films, that not necessarily down from the documentaries, of course, Wittgenstein's ideas you will get a lot, but there are even commercial films. I don't know whether you have seen the film called The Oxford Murderers or Oxford Murders, I don't remember exactly. Anyway, it is Oxford Murders or Oxford Murderers. It is basically about, it's a kind of a crime film. But the idea of Wittgenstein keeps coming up again and again. Not only Wittgenstein, the different philosophers of science, their idea keeps come up in a lot of discussion they have. Particularly, there is a professor and a student, when they are trying to solve the crime, the murders that are happening in Oxford, they make use of all these things. Powerful scenes there where Wittgenstein's ideas are presented. Well, if you have some time at some point, you could always watch that. Well, it's not only from the point of view, it presents many philosophical ideas in a very subtle way here and there. Apparently, of course, there is a narrative, there's a plot that goes along with that. It's all about the logical series, etc., etc. But that I find it quite fascinating as a philosophy person myself, and you also may find it interesting from that point of view. Now, in other words, the world contains facts. So you may choose to think of them anyway. The world contains facts. Now, the beliefs that we have are always reference to the facts. It is only by the reference to the facts that you can come to judge your belief to be true or false. So again, the question of fact becomes very important. So you are not here looking at reality in a very speculative manner. So later, you'll also show how it has given rise to the logical positivism, because of the fact that verifiability becomes an important aspect in logical positivism, because of the idea of the insistence of fact. Now, what is a fact? For Russell, a fact is that kind of thing that makes a proposition true or false. Now, when you say about that kind of thing, it may sound a little weird, but he explains that. Suppose when I make a proposition, it is raining. Now, this proposition, it is raining, is true in a certain condition of weather. Now, this condition of weather is the fact. So, as opposed to it is sunny. So, this condition of weather is the fact. So, which, of course, you can, by which you can make a proposition, namely, it is raining. If that condition didn't exist, then that is false proposition. It's not a true proposition. So it is a condition that makes something factual or non-factual. Now, I think we have briefly discussed about logical atomism. Now, I shall come to logical positivism. Well, again, logical positivism is a way in which it is further developed from logical atomism. Each of these things are of different phases of analytical philosophy we can think of. It is in the second or third decades of the 20th century, particularly when this philosophy became dominant in the Vienna circle, Then we have this famous phase of this philosophy called logical positivism. The prominent thinkers of the Vienna Circle, like Carnap and others, have come up with this logical positivism by way of reconceptualizing empiricism. Now, we have discussed positivism. You remember with the beginning with Auguste Comte. Then we discussed positivism in the different ways it emerged, including J.S. Mill and so on. How you have to go by empirical senses. So the positivism is a heightened form of affirming the only knowledge is a knowledge that we can get through our sense perception, our external senses, and so on. You may like to recall to mind. So this is a way in which they try to reconceptualize empiricism. Now, verifiability therefore becomes an important criterion of meaningfulness. Yes, a meaningful statement or a true statement is something that you can verify. So you see now, it is only after this period the importance of science or the method of science became very important. It is at that time you have got the whole question of it doesn't mean it didn't exist before, but from this moment on there is a whole shift in which the method of natural sciences is also applied in what is came to be known as social sciences, because verifiability, the question of data, where is the data? We keep asking that question today. It has become very part and parcel of our lives thanks to this particular approach of logical positivism. So it is crucial to understand that the sentences that you make must be verifiable. All sentences that you make which are unverifiable are meaningless. However, they are close to your heart, they are meaningless. So therefore you cannot speak about really anything metaphysical. You cannot really speak about God, you cannot speak about anything that is beyond your experience, and you cannot really utter anything meaningful about them. I mean, you might say something, but they don't make any true statement, or they don't make any meaningful statement. Now, the logical positivism therefore has to be seen not merely from the verifiability from the empirical point of view, which is an important content, that is why it is positivism, but also the verifiability can be done logically. In other words, a sentence is true or meaningful if it is analytic. Now, I don't know whether I think I might have used this expression. Now, in the Kantian philosophy had this, not only Kantian, the whole of modern philosophy had this whole distinction between synthetic judgment and analytic judgment, or synthetic propositions and analytic propositions. Synthetic propositions are propositions which give you a new kind of knowledge. Like, for example, when I say it is raining, it is a new kind of knowledge. Now, how do I know it is raining? Because I can observe it. It's through my external senses I come to know. Now, there are certain sentences which you may not be able to verify empirically. They are not synthetic. They don't give new knowledge whatsoever. They are analytic. They are logically, coherent. They cannot be contradictory. For example, when I say bachelor is unmarried, I'm not saying anything new because that is the very meaning of bachelor. But it is logically right. It cannot be a contradictory. You cannot, contradict that, saying, no, it is not right. It is necessarily true. And that is why it is logical positivism. So a meaning or a sentence a proposition is true or meaningful if it is either logically consistent, in other words, analytic. By analyzing the sentence, you come to show they are logically consistent, therefore they are meaningful, or by verifying it empirically, meaning to say, by your external senses, you affirm that to be true or false. Now, that is the meaning of logical positivism. So there is a way in which they are reconceptualizing the positivism, but by bringing in verifiability. But the verifiability is not only in terms of senses. One aspect of it is, yes, it is empirical verifiability, but there is also another kind of verifiability, which is the logical analysis. So now, therefore, the language that you use is conventional in this logical analysis. So bachelor means unmarried, so very conventional language. So one of the famous proponent of this idea is one of the major proponent of this idea is a British philosopher by name Alfred Ewell Ayer, A.J. Ayer. Ayer is spelled as A-Y-E-R, and he has a famous book titled Language, Truth and Logic. Of course, he draws ideas from Russell and Wittgenstein in developing this particular idea of his. So Ayer emphasizes that it is important to understand the purpose and method of philosophy correctly. So the purpose of and method of philosophy is not to make metaphysical statements, and in fact all metaphysical statements are because of certain logical errors. So Ayer states that philosophy should be independent of metaphysics. So in fact philosophy cannot be metaphysical, obviously, because metaphysics does not enable you to make use of this verifiability principle, whereas in philosophy verifiability becomes very important. So you need to be able to show whether the proposition is true or false. Now, having said that, I will now come to the last aspect of I will not come to the modern analytical philosophy. I will come to the question of linguistic philosophy. Now, linguistic philosophy again is a particular phase in analytical philosophy where you have got many philosophers. I'm sure you have heard about some of them if you are particularly a literature student. For example, John Searle or Austin. Now, the philosophy of language is the attempt to give an account of certain general features of the structure, use, and functioning of language. So what does this linguistic philosophy or the philosophy of language tries to do? It tries to solve philosophical problems by using linguistic methods. In fact, Wittgenstein, in his later stage, he moved away from the picture theory of reality. He did not hold on to that anymore. He came up with what came to be known as the language games. Now, there are in order to understand this language game, let us first try to see what is the meaning of in the early phase, he was trying to analyze the structure of formal structure that is hidden by ordinary language. In this later stage, he is trying to analyze the practical use of ordinary language. Now, again, you can see a very close resemblance to pragmatism, especially in terms of Peirce's understanding of pragmatism. So he focused on his analysis of language. In this book is a little later published, Philosophical Investigations. So it is in this book Wittgenstein is trying to analyze the use of language for practical purpose. Now, therefore, it's a matter of what a language communicates. The way it has a practical consequence has to do with the way you are able to use the grammar and the syntax and so on. Now, therefore, he comes up with this language game. You cannot apply the rules of the use of language in one sense to the rules of language in another sense of the use of language. Now let me give a concrete example. Why is it game? For example, you have got different kinds of games. Let us take any ball game, football or basketball for that matter. Now, both of them are ball games, but the rules that are defined for football are very different from the rules that are laid down for basketball. You cannot mix up these two rules. So also you have got different literary genre. So you cannot apply the rules of one literary genre to another. That would be perilous. So, in other words, you could use a particular word in a particular literary form with a completely different meaning, whereas it would be of a different meaning in another thing, like poetry, for example. A text of poetry is not the same as a text of science. In poetry, you will use a lot of symbols, a lot of analogy, and then you cannot take them in a very literal sense of the term. Now, this is quite interesting. Therefore, he distinguishes between what is known as the surface grammar from the depth grammar in the use of words. So, Wittgenstein, stresses the fact that the speaking of language is part of an activity or of a form of life. So Wittgenstein strives to clarify the philosophical concepts of meaning, thinking, and understanding. So, his answers to these questions like why does the man think, what is thinking, are unusual. So, for instance, he even claims that when I say I know what you are thinking, I probably am correct. But if I say I know what I am thinking, I am not all that correct. So in other words, Wittgenstein notes regarding these words, there are a whole cloud of philosophical condensed into a drop of grammar. So with this, I think I will conclude. There are many other ideas that we can talk about, particularly about Austin and others, but then I leave it out. In any case, this is one of the dominant philosophy in the latter part of 20th century. Then we'll take up some questions as well. Thank you very much.